The phone on the front desk rang just as a group of 4 hikers were trying to check out and argue about a minibar charge. I remember the sound of the lobby, the heavy thud of boots on the rug, the smell of damp wool, and the persistent beep of the keycard encoder. When I picked up, it was the school secretary, Mrs. Gable, and her voice had that pinched, helpful quality that usually meant I had forgotten something. "Samantha, we're just checking in on the benefit orientation for Justin," she said. "We have you down for 10:30. Are you almost here?" I looked at the clock. It was 10:35. I was in the middle of a Friday morning rush in Montpelier, and my general manager was in the back office with the regional director. I couldn't just walk out. "I'm sorry," I said, leaning away from the hikers. "I don't have a meeting on my calendar." There was a pause. "Mr. Evans confirmed it via email on Tuesday. He said you'd be the one attending because of your schedule." I hung up and called Matthew. He had been back from his rotation for 3 days, and the house still felt like it was adjusting to his weight. He answered on the second ring, his voice sounding relaxed, the sound of the dishwasher running in the background. "The school called?" I said. "Something about a benefit orientation for Justin." "Oh, right," he said. "I already made the call that. I figured it was easier to just get it on the books while I was still on the rig. I thought you saw the confirmation." "I didn't see a confirmation, Matt. I'm at work. I'm the supervisor on duty. It's just a quick thing, Sam. 10 minutes. You can probably just slide out for a bit. I can take Justin if you want, but they said a parent had to sign the actual benefit forms in person for the insurance side of it." "I can't just slide out," I said. I looked over at Sarah, one of my front desk clerks who was efficiently handling the hikers' dispute with a level of patience I didn't have. She had the minibar charges sorted in seconds, her voice steady and professional. I felt a sharp pinch of embarrassment that I was the one fumbling the logistics. "I thought you'd just handle it," Matthew replied, his tone shifting into that breezy, dismissive register he used when he wanted a problem to vanish. "You're always the one who keeps the calendar straight. I just told them you'd be there." I closed my eyes for a second, listening to the lobby noise swell. The regional director stepped out of the back office, scanning the room with a sharp, expectant gaze. If I left now, it wouldn't be a slide out. It would be a visible abandonment of my post during a peak window. "I'm not the one who scheduled it," I whispered into the phone, my voice tight. "I have to call Mrs. Gable back and tell her I'm not coming. You're going to have to figure out a way to get those forms signed today, because I am not leaving this desk." I ended the call and dialed the school. The silence on the other end, when I explained the miscommunication, felt heavy, a professional stain on the reliability I'd spent years building with the administration. Mrs. Gable didn't argue, but her tone had shifted from pinched to cold. I remember Tuesday night, the evening before the school's email had gone out. Matthew had been home for 2 days, and he'd fallen right back into his rhythm of managing the house's physical edges. He was standing at the kitchen island, sorting through a stack of mail with a precision that always made me feel a little chaotic by comparison. He had the bills categorized, the junk tossed, and the invitations filed. It was the one thing he did without needing a reminder, a kind of domestic bookkeeping that I actually relied on. "I'm getting the school stuff sorted for Justin," he'd said, not looking up from a utility bill. "The insurance transition, the benefit forms. I've got a handle on it." I had been leaning against the counter, still wearing my hotel blazer, my feet aching from a 10-hour shift. I remember feeling a wave of genuine relief. For months, I had been the only person who knew when the permission slips were due, or which day the trash went out. The mental load had felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, and having him step back into that space felt like finally being able to exhale. "You sure?" I asked. Mrs. Gable is usually pretty particular about the deadlines. "I'm sure, Sam. I've already been in touch," he replied. He'd given me that small, confident smile, the one that suggested he had a plan, even if he wasn't sharing the details. I didn't ask for the specifics. I didn't ask to see the emails or check the shared calendar, which we rarely actually shared. I just trusted the familiar version of him, the man who could organize a drilling site in a storm, the man who had stepped up and I already made the call, the mortgage paperwork, when I was recovering from my gallbladder surgery 3 years ago. I told myself that asking for a confirmation email would be nagging, or worse, a sign that I didn't trust him. I wanted to believe that for 1 week I didn't have to be the project manager for our entire lives. "Okay," I said. "Just let me know if you need me to sign anything." "I'll let you know," he'd said. Looking back on it now, I can see where I stopped checking the details. I had accepted the convenience of his assurance because it was easier than the effort of verification. I had let my desire for a partner in the logistics override my instinct for the schedule. It wasn't that I was lazy. I was just tired of being the only one who cared about the margins. I had even felt a flicker of guilt for doubting him when I saw the notification on my phone later that night. I didn't open it. I just saw a snippet of a message from the school and assumed it was just a general announcement. I remember thinking, Matthew has this. I can just be a mom for a few hours instead of an administrator. That was the wrong read. I had mistaken his desire to be helpful for a commitment to the actual details of my working life. He hadn't considered that handling it for him meant making a decision on my behalf, assuming my time was a flexible resource that could be shifted to fit his version of efficiency. I sat there in the silence of the lobby after the call with Mrs. Gable, the regional director still hovering nearby. I realized I had traded my professional reputation for a few hours of perceived help, and the trade had been made without my consent. I looked down at the desk, at the neatly aligned key cards and the polished surface, and felt a sudden, cold distance from the man who was currently running the dishwasher at home. The regional director, Mr. Henderson, didn't say anything about the phone call, but he stayed in the lobby for another 20 minutes, his eyes tracking every movement. I could feel the shift in the air, the way my usually seamless control of the front desk had developed a hairline fracture. I spent the rest of the shift overcorrecting, double-checking the room assignments and hovering over the clerks. At one point, I caught Sarah looking at me. She had that expression of cautious neutrality, the one you use when you know your boss is vibrating with a frequency that might snap. I realized I had been treating her like a subordinate to be managed, rather than a partner in the shift. "I'm sorry if I've been on your back this morning, Sarah," I said, stepping away from the computer. "I had a bit of a scramble with the school. I'm a little off." Sarah shrugged, a small, genuine movement. "It's Friday, Sam. We've all had them." It was a small admission, a concrete wrong, but it felt like the only thing I could actually fix in that moment. I couldn't erase the coldness in Mrs. Gable's voice, and I couldn't undo the fact that Henderson had seen me rattled, but I could stop the bleed with my staff. When I finally got home, the house smelled like the roast chicken Matthew had put in the oven. He was in the garage, and I could hear the rhythmic clatter of him organizing the heavy plastic bins. That was his space, his domain. He had a way of tackling the physical edges of our lives, the gutters, the lawnmower, the winter tires, with a focused intensity that I always admired. He didn't need a list or a reminder. He just saw a disorder and corrected it. I walked into the kitchen and found Justin at the table. He was 15, but he had a quiet, steady way about him that often made me feel like the impulsive one. He was methodically highlighting a history textbook, his notes neat and categorized. He didn't look up when I came in, but he pushed a glass of water toward me. "Dad said you were stressed," Justin said, his voice flat but not unkind. "Did you miss the thing?" "I did," I said, leaning against the counter. "There was a mix-up. I can probably just email Mrs. Gable," Justin offered. "She usually listens to me if I tell her I forgot to remind you." I looked at my son, seeing the way he was already trying to buffer the tension between us. It was a good trait, a kind of emotional maturity that probably came from watching me carry the logistics for so long, but it felt like another small failure on my part. Matthew came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked refreshed, the oil-field grime replaced by the scrubbed cleanliness of a man on his second week of leave. He saw my face and immediately shifted into that minimizer posture, his shoulders dropping, his voice softening into a plea for the room to just move on. "The chicken's almost done," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I think we can just call the school on Monday and tell them there was a family emergency. They'll understand. It's just a few forms, Sam. It's not a federal crime. It's not about the forms." "Matt," I said, but my voice lacked the sharp edge it had on the phone. "It's about the fact that I looked unreliable to the people I deal with every day." "You're the most reliable person I know," he replied, and for a second I wanted to believe him. He stepped closer, the smell of sawdust and soap clinging to him. "I was just trying to take something off your plate. I didn't think it was a big deal." He didn't apologize for the decision, only for the result. He treated the mistake as a byproduct of his kindness rather than a lapse in respect. I didn't argue, mostly because I was too tired to fight the current of his confidence. I just watched him move to the oven, his movements efficient and sure, and I wondered how many other conveniences he had arranged while I was busy trusting him. Monday morning arrived with a gray, clinging mist typical for a Vermont October. I woke up with a knot in my stomach, thinking about Mrs. Gable and the way she'd sounded on the phone. I spent the first 20 minutes of my day staring at the coffee maker, wondering if I should call the school myself to apologize again, or if that would only make me look more frantic. Matthew was already dressed, looking crisp in a flannel shirt, his boots polished. He hovered near the kitchen table where Justin was eating a bowl of cereal, staring blankly at a piece of toast. "I'll swing by the school on my way to the hardware store," Matthew said, his voice casual, as if he were mentioning a trip to the mailbox. "I'll get the forms signed and sorted. I can probably talk to Mrs. Gable and smooth things over." I stopped mid-pour with the coffee. "You can do that?" I thought they said a parent had to sign, but the orientation was the part I missed. "I'll handle it," he said, giving me a quick, reassuring pat on the shoulder as he passed. "I've got away with these people. I'll tell her there was a scheduling conflict on your end, and I've got it under control now. It'll be a non-issue by noon." I felt that familiar pull, the desire to let the weight slide off my shoulders. I remembered how he'd navigated the insurance nightmare after my surgery, calling agents and arguing about deductibles until the problem simply ceased to exist. He had a specific kind of persistence that I lacked, a willingness to push through a conversation until the other person gave in, to end it. I told myself that this was him taking ownership of the mistake. I assumed he felt the weight of my professional embarrassment and was trying to erase it for me. "Okay," I said. "Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate you fixing this." I left the details of his plan alone and ignored the question of office hours. I trusted the version of him that was the fixer, the man who could make the chaos stop. It was the same mistake I'd made on Tuesday, but this time it felt like a repair. I let myself believe that he was stepping into the gap to protect my reputation. When I got to the hotel, the lobby was quiet, but the atmosphere felt different. Mr. Henderson was already there, standing by the window, checking his watch. He skipped his usual curt nod and pointed toward the computer. "The weekend reports are lagging, Samantha," he said. "I need the occupancy projections for the next 3 weeks on my desk by 10. "I'm on it," I said, moving quickly to the terminal. I spent the next 2 hours in a blur of spreadsheets and room block adjustments. I worked with a frantic kind of precision, trying to prove that the scramble from Friday hadn't touched my actual competence. Sarah was beside me, quietly handling a check-in for a corporate group, her movements fluid and automatic. She kept the school and the phone call out of the conversation, sliding a cup of tea onto the desk next to my keyboard without saying a word. Around 11, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Matthew. "All set. Forms are in. Gable was fine. Don't worry about it." I felt a momentary surge of relief, a tightening in my chest loosening. I thanked him in a quick reply and went back to the projections. I brushed past why Mrs. Gable, who had been cold and pinched on Friday, would suddenly be fine, simply because Matthew had smoothed things over. I overlooked the possibility that fine was the word used for a conversation where the other person has stopped trying to communicate. I wanted the week to be normal again. I went back to the spreadsheets, believing the problem was solved, while Henderson continued to watch me from the corner of his eye. The relief of that text message lasted exactly 4 hours. I spent the afternoon moving through the hotel with a lightness I hadn't felt since Matthew stepped off the plane. I stopped hovering over Sarah. I even managed a genuine smile for a guest who was complaining about the lack of hypoallergenic pillows. I felt like the version of myself I preferred, the one who was competent at her job and supported at home. I was in the middle of updating the room block for a wedding party when a notification popped up on my screen. It was an email from Mrs. Gable. "Dear Samantha C." it began. "Thank you for having Mr. Evans stop by this morning. We have the signed forms on file. Per his request, we have rescheduled your orientation for Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. to accommodate the family health issues he mentioned. We hope things are stabilizing." I read the sentence 3 times. Family health issues? For a second, I wondered if she was referring to my gallbladder surgery from 3 years ago. I remember thinking that maybe Matthew had brought it up as a way to explain why I was so stressed, a clumsy attempt to give me some grace in the eyes of the school administration. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the delete key, wanting to believe it was just a misunderstanding of terms. Then I looked at the date. Wednesday at 2 p.m. Wednesday was the day Mr. Henderson was returning for the final quarterly audit. He had explicitly told me that he wanted me on the floor from noon until 5 to walk him through the new occupancy projections. There was no sliding out for an orientation on Wednesday. I felt a cold, familiar hollow open up in my chest. Matthew hadn't smoothed things over by fixing the problem. He had smoothed them over by inventing a narrative. He had traded a factual error, a missed appointment, for a vague, sympathetic lie. He had told the school I was dealing with some kind of crisis so they would stop being cold to me. And in the process, he had scheduled another appointment during my most critical work window of the month. He had treated my professional schedule as a suggestion and my reputation as something that could be managed through a strategic bit of pity. I didn't call him immediately. I sat there staring at the glowing screen, listening to the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner in the hallway. I typed a reply to Mrs. Gable, my fingers stiff. I didn't explicitly call out the lie, but I stated clearly that there were no health issues and that Wednesday at 2 p.m. was impossible. I asked for the latest possible slot on Thursday. When I finally called Matthew, I didn't lead with a question. Why did you tell the school we have family health issues? There was a long silence on the other end. I didn't want you to look like a flake, Sam. Gable was being a pill. I just gave her something she could put in a file so she'd stop judging you. You gave her a lie that makes me look unstable, I said. And you scheduled it during the quarterly audit. I forgot about the audit, he said, his voice slipping back into that breezy, minimizing tone. Just tell Henderson you have a doctor's appointment. He'll never know the difference. The suggestion stung. He wasn't just managing the school. He was suggesting I manage my boss with the same dishonesty. I looked at the email again. Mrs. Gable hadn't replied yet, but the health issues were already part of the record. I had tried to correct the narrative, but the seed of instability had already been planted in the one place. I couldn't easily scrub it clean. I remember the drive home that evening. The drizzle had turned the roads into a slick, charcoal gray, and I spent the whole trip rehearsing the words I would use to make him understand. I wanted him to see the gap between helping and interfering. I wanted him to realize that in my world, a scheduling conflict is a professional lapse, but a family health issue is a red flag. When I walked through the door, the house was quiet. Justin had already started the dishwasher and had laid out the mail on the counter, sorted by urgency. He didn't look up as I came in, just kept scrubbing a pot at the sink, his movements steady and methodical. He was the only one in the house who seemed to understand that the air had changed. Matthew was in the living room, leaning back in his chair, with a tablet in his lap. He looked up and smiled, but it was that tight, expectant smile he used when he was waiting for me to stop being angry. Did you talk to the school? He asked. I told them there were no health issues, I said, dropping my keys on the table with a loud clatter. I told them I couldn't do Wednesday. I'm still waiting to hear if they can move it to Thursday. See? I told you it would be fine, he said, his voice breezy. You just had to ask. Gable probably just used a template for the email. She probably didn't even mean it literally. It's in the record, Matt. She wrote it. I stepped closer, my voice rising. Why did you do that? Why couldn't you just say you made a mistake with the date? He sighed, a long, theatrical sound that suggested I was the one being unreasonable. Because I was trying to protect you. I didn't want her thinking you were some disorganized mess who can't keep a calendar. I gave her a reason that sounded legitimate, so she'd stop being a pill about the missed meeting. You didn't protect me, I said. You made me a patient. This is landing harder than I meant, he replied, his tone shifting into that dismissive register. It's one email to a school secretary. It's not like it's going on your permanent employment record at the hotel. I remember the sudden, hot flash of frustration. I didn't think. I just reached out and swept the tablet off his lap. It didn't break, but it skittered across the hardwood floor with a sharp plastic crack. Pick it up, he said, his voice suddenly cold. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is the stress. This is why I told her things were hectic. I froze. my hand still in the air. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I had given him the evidence he needed to justify the lie. By snapping, I had validated the narrative he'd created for the school, and I knew it. I felt a wave of shame, not because I was wrong to be angry, but because I had played right into the version of me he found convenient to manage. "I'm sorry I threw the tablet," I said, my voice small, "but that doesn't change the fact that you lied about my life to a stranger." "I didn't lie," he muttered, finally leaning down to retrieve the device. "I framed it. There's a difference." He didn't apologize for the bypass. He didn't admit that he had treated my professional boundaries as movable fences. He just wanted the room to move on, to return to the version of the week where he was the hero who had smoothed things over. I didn't push him further. I couldn't. I just stood there, watching him wipe a smudge off the screen with his thumb. By then, I knew I couldn't trust the fixer version of Matthew anymore. I couldn't trust him to handle a single phone call or a single form without checking the fine print afterward. "I'm going to call Mrs. Gable one more time," I said. "And this time, I'm going to ask her exactly what was said during the visit. I want the full version, not the framed one." Matthew didn't look up. He just shifted his weight in the chair and went back to his tablet, the silence between us settling into something functional, cold, and entirely unresolved. I didn't call Mrs. Gable right away. I waited until the next morning, letting the silence in the house settle into a heavy, familiar rhythm. I remember the way the kitchen felt. Too bright, the air smelling of the lemon cleaner Matthew had used on the counters. He was acting as if the tablet incident had been a momentary lapse in my character, something to be overlooked in favor of a productive Tuesday. When I finally dialed the school, my voice sounded thin to my own ears. "Mrs. Gable? This is Samantha Evans. I'm calling to confirm that Thursday at 4 works for the orientation." "Yes, we have you down," she said. Her tone was professional, the pinch gone, replaced by a flat, efficient courtesy. "I have the notes from Mr. Evans here. He mentioned the family health situation was making things difficult to coordinate. We're happy to be flexible." I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell her that there was no situation, that my husband had simply invented a crisis to cover a scheduling error. I wanted to scrub the word unstable, which is what flexible usually meant in a school file, off my name. But I knew that if I pushed too hard, I would just sound like the frantic person Matthew had already described. "I appreciate the flexibility," I said, my voice tight. "Everything is under control now." "Glad to hear it," she replied, and the call ended. I put the phone down and looked at Matthew. He was standing by the door, his keys in his hand, ready to head out for a few errands. He saw me watching him and shifted his weight, his expression guarded. "Did she move it?" he asked. "Thursday at 4, I said. "She still thinks we're in the middle of a medical crisis, Matt." He sighed, a short, sharp sound of annoyance. "I already told you, I was just trying to get her off your back. I didn't think she'd actually write it down as a situation. I just thought she'd see it as a reason to stop being so rigid about the 10:30 slot." "You didn't think," I said. "That's the problem." "Look," he said, his voice softening, though he still wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "I overstepped. I get it. I thought I was helping, but I guess I didn't realize how you guys do things at the school." It wasn't a full apology. He still framed it as a misunderstanding of how things are done. But it was the closest he ever got to admitting a mistake. I didn't tell him that it wasn't about the school's culture, but about the fact that he'd used a lie to manage my life. I just nodded, the anger having evolved into a dull, exhausted ache. "I'll take Justin to his soccer practice for the rest of the week," Matthew added, "and I'll handle the school drop-offs. You just focus on your audit. I'll stay out of the calendar." It was a practical repair. He was taking a concrete block of parenting off my plate, a gesture that, in any other week, I would have welcomed with relief. But as I watched him walk out the door, I realized the cost of that help. I didn't trust him with the calendar anymore, and I didn't trust him with the narrative of my own life. Justin came into the kitchen then, carrying a folder of papers he'd brought home from his history project. He didn't say anything about the tension or the phone call. He just walked over to the fridge and pinned a new sports schedule to the corkboard, aligning the edges with a precision that mirrored his father's, but without the arrogance. "I already told the coach I'm riding with Dad this week," Justin said quietly. He had seen the fracture and adjusted his own orbit to avoid the blast radius. I looked at my son, then at the empty doorway where Matthew had been, and I felt a strange, cold clarity. The house was functioning again. The chores were being done, and the schedule was technically sorted, but the space between me and my husband had narrowed into something small and transactional. I picked up my bag and headed for the hotel, the silence of the house following me all the way to the car. The quarterly audit with Mr. Henderson was a sterile 4-hour exercise in precision. He didn't ask about my week, and he didn't mention the scramble from Friday. He simply sat at the small circular table in the lobby, his eyes moving rapidly across the occupancy projections I had spent 3 nights refining. I stood beside him, pointing out the shifts in corporate bookings and the projected dip for November, keeping my voice level and my explanations brief. There was no moment of cinematic vindication. He didn't tell me I'd done a great job or apologize for his hovering. When he finally closed the folder, he just gave a short, sharp nod. "The numbers are tight, Samantha. Keep them this way," he said. He stood up, checked his watch, and walked toward the exit without another word. I felt a slight loosening in my chest, but it wasn't a victory. It was just the absence of a penalty. I had maintained my standing, but the effort it had taken to scrub the perception of instability from my professional air had left me feeling hollowed out. When I got home that evening, the house was unusually quiet. Matthew had already taken Justin to soccer practice. He'd been consistent with the drop-offs all week, handling the logistics with the same focused intensity he used in the garage. He didn't miss a time, and he didn't forget a piece of equipment. He was perfectly competent at the task, which only made the lingering distrust feel more stubborn. Justin came through the door an hour later, smelling of damp grass and old cleats. He dropped his bag by the door and headed straight for the kitchen. "Dad's picking up pizza on the way back," Justin said, not looking at me. He said, "You should just relax since the audit is over." The phrase relax felt like another attempt to manage me, a way of suggesting that my stress was a condition to be treated rather than a reaction to his choices. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him that relaxing wasn't the point. I went into the living room and found my phone on the side table. For the last 3 years, we had used a shared digital calendar for the house, a convenience I had managed and maintained. It was the portal through which I already made the call, the school orientation, and framed my life to Mrs. Gable. I opened the settings and removed his access to my work calendar. Then, I changed the permissions on the family account so that he could see the events, but he could no longer edit them or add new appointments. If he wanted to schedule something, he would have to ask me first, in a conversation, with a date and a time. When Matthew walked in with the pizza boxes, he saw me staring at the screen. He paused, his expression guarded, sensing a shift he couldn't quite name. Everything okay? He asked. I updated the calendar, I said, my voice flat. From now on, if you want to schedule something for me or Justin, just text me the details. I'll put it on the books. He started to say something, probably a comment about how this was unnecessary or how I thought I was making it easier. But he stopped. Himself. He looked at the pizza, then back at me, and the breezy confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward realization that the smoothing over phase was finished. Fine, he said. Whatever works. He set the pizza on the counter and went to wash his hands. I stayed in the living room, the silence of the house feeling functional and distant, while the sound of the faucet ran in the other room.